Professor Sir John Curtis is now on the line. Professor, thanks very much for joining us. My latest figures are these. Labour has a net gain in England of 22 councillors. In London, which once it became clear that the red wall had not fallen to them, they started to sing the song that, look how well we've done in London, but they now have a net gain of 0 in the capital. They won 3 boroughs and they lost 3 boroughs. They won the 3 of the richest boroughs and lost 3 of the poorest boroughs, including 2 directly elected mayors. Do you think that might be the reason why Keir Starmer just cancelled all his engagements tomorrow? Is there something happening? Some tectonic plates shifting, do you think?
Oh, I think the reason, presumably, why Sir Keir Starmer has cancelled his engagements tomorrow is because of the intricacies of what we now come to know as Beergate, i.e. the fact that he's now being investigated by Durham police for allegations that he might have broken the lockdown rules before the Hartlepool by-election. And that, of course, is extremely embarrassing for him, given that how strongly he's pursued the Prime Minister on the issue. But, I mean, if we come back to Labour's performance in the elections, you're quite right about London. Initially, it looked as though Labour was doing better in London than elsewhere. On the sample of boroughs that I have, I've got about 10 a dozen of the detailed voting figures. Actually, Labour's votes slightly down in London as compared with 2018 when the seats were last fought, and that actually is pretty typical across England as a whole. And I mean, the narrative that the Labour Party itself has argued, and I suppose not unreasonable, but it's certainly selective, is to say, well, we've done better than we did in the 2019 general election, which of course was a bit of a disaster. We've done better than we did in the local elections last year, which was also pretty much of a disaster. So look, we are making progress. But the problem is, of course, is that what Sir Keir is wanting to demonstrate is that he can take his party to heights that his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, couldn't achieve. And basically not doing any better than was done in 2018, when Labour was led by Jeremy Corbyn, and which happened to be Labour's best electoral performance in local elections under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, does therefore mean that the claim that progress is being made on the record of the predecessor is still not clearly sustained. At best, you can argue it was kind of almost as good. So that's, in a sense, the big takeaway. And the gains, such gains as Labour have made in councils and seats, both within and outside of London, are effectively a reflection of the fact that the Conservatives definitely are down from where they were 4 years ago. They're 4 or 5 points down. And if your opponents go down and you sit still, then you're going to pick up some seats, even though you haven't yourselves made much in the way of progress. Of course, the other embarrassment in the end for the Labour Party was that there was another party that did make some progress, and in the end made rather more gains, and that was the Liberal Democrats. And that, of course, was the one thing that nobody was really expecting.
No, quite. So the Keir Starmer Labour Party, whose raison d'etre, defined by themselves, was to leave Corbynism behind, has actually done slightly less well, from what you've said, than they did under Corbyn, which is a slightly surprising outcome, certainly perverse. Go on.
Well, they did slightly less well than Jeremy Corbyn's best outcome. They certainly did better than Corbyn in 2016, 2017 and 2019. It's just that 2018 is the high point. But if you're going to unambiguously claim to be doing better than your predecessor, then in a sense, you need to be able to get over the highest hurdle. And then Labour didn't,
quite so.
Labour in their performance on last Thursday didn't quite get over the highest hurdle.
Quite so. The low-hanging fruit of this Tory government, with its high taxes, national insurance hikes, big increases in the cost of living, the behavior of the Prime Minister, his personal conduct, the poor odour in which he is widely held, even inside his own party. He's not out the woods yet, is he, in terms of a challenge to his leadership? If you can't pluck that kind of low-hanging fruit, then you'd have to say that Sir Keir Starmer is not currently looking like the next Prime Minister.
Well, you're certainly right that, well, I mean, the reason why I guess there's been a degree of excitement, if that's the right word, about the political situation over the last 2 or 3 months is that it has been the first time, and it's now been confirmed by these local elections, it's the first time that the Labour Party has been ahead of the Conservative Party in the polls. We had 2 years of the Conservative Party at least being even Stevens and usually being ahead. And I suppose, therefore, given that certainly the opposition and inevitably many a journalist have been looking for the chink in the armour of apparent Conservative invincibility, that has been evident in recent years. And indeed, if you take the Conservatives' performance in these local elections, with the exception of 2019, when the local elections took place, when Theresa May was struggling to get her Brexit agreement through her party and through the House of Commons, and indeed was only to resign a few weeks later. Apart from that, this is actually the worst Conservative performance in the local elections since before the EU referendum. So it's also an indicating that the delivery of Brexit doesn't necessarily guarantee Conservative electoral success. But certainly, I mean, the estimate that we put out was that the Labour Party is about 5 points ahead of the Conservatives in the local ballot boxes. If everybody had the chance to vote, the opinion polls say it's 6. If you go back to the days of either when David Cameron was leader of the opposition or Tony Blair, then in those instances, both of them recorded much, much bigger leads over the opposition before eventually going on to win a general election in 2010 and 1997, respectively. Now, that said, however, we can't necessarily jump from that to say that Sir Keir Starmer doesn't have any chance of becoming Prime Minister. Because the other thing we have to bear in mind is that the Conservative Party doesn't have any friends inside the House of Commons. At the moment, both the result on Thursday and the opinion polls are essentially pointing to a hung parliament, and a hung parliament in which the Conservatives would not be anything like close to 326. Given that it looks as though none of the other parties in the House of Commons will be willing to help to sustain a Conservative minority administration, including the DUP, the hurdle that the Conservatives have to get past, they have to get a majority. If they fail, they're probably out on their ear, that probably means about having to be about 3 or 4 points ahead, which they're not at the moment. Now, of course, what is then true if we get a hung parliament, Sir Keir will be faced with the task of having to bargain and strike a deal with one or more opposition parties. Doubtless his preferred party would be the Liberal Democrats, but their price would probably be doing something pretty significant on proportional representation. But even they may not have the numbers. Indeed, on Thursday's vote, kind of nip and tuck whether they would. The alternative, of course, is the SNP, and the price of the SNP would extract would be some kind of referendum on constitutional change in Scotland, in which independence is at least one of the options on the ballot paper. Now, these are both pretty tough choices with potential long-term implications, not only for the Labour Party, but also for British politics in general. But at the end of the day, one has to understand the realpolitik here. History suggests that when leaders of the opposition are faced with the choice between becoming the next Prime Minister or losing the leadership of their party, they tend to be willing to strike the deal that enables them to become Prime Minister. And I would cite as a very clear example of that, David Cameron in 2010, who 2 days before polling day said, absolute disaster if it's a hung parliament. There would be chaos etc., etc. What was happening? Well, actually, privately, Oliver Letwin, his policy guru, was reading the Liberal Democrat manifesto in fine deal, and the Conservatives were all ready to negotiate with the Liberal Democrats what was in the end was a coalition deal. So don't necessarily accept the rhetorical claims that are made before an election. When realpolitik clicks in, then we will discover that some of those promises won't necessarily hold a great deal of water.
But let's imagine I'm I'm the Prime Minister and you're my advisor. You'd be saying to me, you have to fight this as a choice between stable government and a coalition of chaos. Every rag bag of opposition party all fighting inside a big marquee. Nothing would be solid, nothing would be certain. Even the continued existence of the country as a state would be at risk. And that would be a powerful electoral plea, wouldn't it? Because you've just said that's the alternative to another Tory government.
Well, that's your characterization of the alternative, George. My answer to you is that was precisely the message from David Cameron in 2010, when, of course, during the election campaign, there had been a dramatic rise in Liberal Democrat support, much of which disappeared by polling day, but it dominated the campaign. It didn't get him an overall majority. Now, Conservative politicians certainly believe that the campaign they fought in 2015, in which they portrayed Ed Miliband as being in Alex Salmond's and then Nicola Sturgeon's pocket, was effective and enabled them to win the 2015 general election with an overall majority, somewhat to people's surprise. I would, however, make two observations about that. The first is that I think the reason why that campaign, in a sense, had legs, but why also it probably didn't have that much impact, is that it was feeding an image and an impression of Ed Miliband that the electorate already had. That is, that he was relatively weak. I'm not sure that the same trick would work with Keir Starmer. So Keir may not be charismatic, but nobody really thinks of him as being particularly weak. And in any event, there isn't an awful lot of real hard data on this, but certainly what I can say to you is that it was already the case, even before the 2015 election was fought, that around half the public thought that the Labour Party would be willing to do a deal with the SNP if they needed to do so. So actually, again, this was already quite heavily baked in. That proportion did go up 10 points during the election campaign. But if you then actually look at the switching, or rather the non-switching of the people who, before the election campaign, didn't think that Labour would do a deal with the SNP, but by the end thought they did these people swing to the Conservatives? Well, the answer is no. So, I think one of the problems with elections is that the victors will always claim that their campaign was effective because, of course, they won. Actually, the reason why they won doesn't necessarily lie in the campaign they fought. And it's not clear to me that the Conservative explanation as to why they won in 2015 is correct. The other thing, by the way, to bear in mind is that actually a plurality, at least, of Labour supporters in England think that Scotland should have a referendum. So it's not entirely clear that how far this is actually something that would put off potential voters to the Labour Party even south of the border.
Now, Sir John, you're in Scotland. I'm also in Scotland. We'll come to that last. But penultimately, the red wall did not turn red again. I saw a result from Walsall just before I came in the studio. A massive 15% drop in the Labour vote in Walsall, in the West Midlands, former Labour heartland, industrial Britain, the heart of industrial Britain, or was. The Tories won a seat from Labour, with the Labour vote falling 15%. And you'll have far more knowledge and examples of that. To what do you attribute the failure of Labour to capture at least some of its red wall?
Right. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than people appreciate. By the way, to Walsall, I would add Newcastle under Lyme. That's one the Labour Party should have denied the Conservatives overall control and failed to do so. However, it is a bit more complicated. Um, if you actually, it's certainly true that if you compare what happened in the most Leave parts of the country with the most pro-Remain parts, despite what we said earlier about London, which of course is the most pro-Remain part of the country, there is no doubt that as compared with 2018, insofar as Labour did lose ground, they were more likely to lose it in Leave areas, and that was particularly true of the north of England. So that much is true. However, if you compare the results this year with those last year, which you can do outside of London, actually Labour did make more progress as compared with last year in Leave voting areas than in Remain voting areas. Okay, so there are signs of Labour making some progress with a capital S in Leave voting areas. The problem is that the amount that Labour has lost since 2016 in Leave voting areas as compared with Remain voting areas is so substantial that, you know, what was a little bit of improvement in 2022 just isn't enough to reverse it. And it does therefore mean that, given that we're still focusing on the comparison with 4 years ago, it wasn't even enough to reverse the movement caused by Brexit as compared with 4 years ago. And the truth is, Brexit's left an enormous legacy on the electoral geography of Britain. It's particularly had a legacy on the Conservatives to a lesser degree, but it's still there on Labour. And it's going to take quite a long time probably for the Labour Party to begin to reverse it. But of course, what you should bear in mind is that, you know, next year's local elections, 2019, will be the baseline. By that stage, a lot of Brexit will be baked in. And then the general election, you know, the impact of Brexit is its height. So you'll begin to find, I think, even if Labour isn't always making that much progress, that increasingly we will find that Labour are at least recouping some of the lost ground. But recouping all of it, that's going to be pretty difficult.
But you don't think that they could make more progress with, just to use your word, a more charismatic leader, an Andy Burnham maybe?
Well, Andy Burnham might be one possibility, but then you do have to remember that Mr. Burnham did stand in the leadership election in 2015 and was one of three candidates who was unable to persuade Labour Party membership that he would be any more effective than Jeremy Corbyn. If you were to actually get me to guess, well, who might be the dark horse this time? I mean, Andy Burnham is not in the House of Commons, so if Beergate causes Sir Keir Starmer to resign, he's not going to be available. The person who is undoubtedly making a favourable impression is Wes Streeting, who is proving to be an extremely adept opposition spokesman. Now, you know, again, not that experienced, and obviously one question mark would be, you know, would he end up being a flash in the pan in the way that Rishi Sunak appeared to be? Because Rishi Sunak was also extremely articulate, but then has imploded over his wife's non-dom status and the Spring Statement and all the rest of it. So Mr. Streeting certainly has got a few more spurs to earn, but he is certainly somebody who's beginning somebody who does, I think, potentially can make the kind of impact on the electorate that would make people sit up and take a listen. But he isn't going to take the party to the left, George. You know, he's very clearly, firmly, you know.
No, in fact, he's off to...
He does have the personal qualities that are needed.
He's off to Israel in the morning, so maybe he's already off and running. Finally, the Daily Record, for our international audience, will describe it as well, once upon a time, a mass market tabloid in Scotland, small market now, but still influential, has a poll out tonight that shows just 23% of the people polled wanting an independence referendum in 2023. Find symmetry that. And that's the policy of the Scottish Nationalist Party, which campaigns for independence. Are we in for an early referendum, and how could one come about?
We are in for an attempt to hold an early referendum because I think the SNP will want either to have tried and succeeded or to have tried and failed. But either way, they will regard it in their interest to try. If they manage to succeed, all well and good from their point of view, although of course it's an extremely risky project because Scotland is divided 50-50 on the question as to which way it would vote. But trying and failing is also fine because that would set it up how it would campaign in the UK general election, which is coming down the track by the end of 2024. Not that I think that the SNP, so far as the electorate is concerned, is necessarily under that much pressure to hold it by the end of 2023. Basically, the message of polls has been for some time, and I think it's true of the poll that you're citing, is that people who voted yes don't necessarily feel the referendum has to be within the next 12 months. They just simply think it needs to happen before 2026, i.e. before the end of the SNP's parliamentary term. So actually, yes, voters, many of them are quite patient. But this takes us back to the earlier part of our conversation. Sure, the current UK government is certainly not minded to acquiesce, although whether or not the legal position is quite as clear as they believe is another, potentially long debate. It might depend on the question that the SNP put on the ballot paper. But if indeed the Conservatives lose their majority at the next election, and if the SNP have the bargaining power, then that's the moment at which the SNP will be wanting to use the power it would have at Westminster in order to try and basically force a referendum. And my own view is that if the Labour Party tries to form a minority administration without the support of the SNP, and it doesn't otherwise have the votes, that the SNP will be willing to gum up the votes at Westminster and may well be willing to bring that Labour administration down. So,
well, they've done that before. They've done that before, of course. I said lastly, but one quick one. It's only fair for me to mention that Labour in Scotland did better than Labour in England, has now overtaken the Conservatives as the second party in the country. To what do you attribute that?
Oh, I don't think it's necessarily true, George, that the Labour Party did better in Scotland than they did in England, because it's a different baseline. In Scotland, the last election was in 2017, and Labour didn't do as well in England in 2017 as they did in 2018. The rise in Labour's vote, 2 points, on the back of what frankly was a disaster in 2017, the party falling into third place with just 20% of the vote. And the principal reason why the Labour Party is second is actually because of the sharp decline of the Conservative vote from what was a very high baseline. The Conservatives were having to defend their best local election results since 1982, but it's basically Conservative down 6, Labour up 2. So a 2-point lead over the Conservatives is essentially the product of the Conservative decline. And if you compare the progress that Labour made with the modest progress the SNP made in these local elections, they're both up by just over 1.5 points. So the gap between the SNP and the Labour Party is exactly the same as it was in 2017. And of course, if Labour is going to win much in the way of parliamentary seats north of the border, it's not the Conservatives they have to catch up on, it's the SNP. And there isn't any evidence in these local elections that the Labour Party has made any progress in that endeavour.
Although in our city of Glasgow, they came within a hair's breadth of recapturing.
Yeah, sure, but that's essentially because the SNP were losing votes to the Greens, who of course are also part of the pro-independent side.
Sir John Curtis, Professor, thank you very much indeed.